Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready when I... Okay, welcome back to Live from the Heartland for the week of December 21st. And as I said at the outset, we're going to talk a little bit about immigration and the new president-elect's threats to send millions of people out of the country. I'm really happy to bring on our first guest, Ed Yohnka of the American Civil Liberties Union. Hello to you, Ed.
Hello. It's great to be here with you today.
Well, thanks for coming on. I have to say that I've always been I haven't ever sent money, but I haven't sent much money to anybody. But I've always looked to the ACLU for leadership and confident that they will do the right thing. That it's kind of been the ACLU coming to the rescue. And, I get a lot of emails, as I'm sure many of the listeners or viewers of the show do, from the ACLU talking about the ACLU is ready to fight, time for the fight, and been really talking it up. So I thought, you've talked about bringing lawyers into courtrooms, advocates in front of state legislators, organizers and communities. And I thought it'd be good to get firsthand from someone who's in the ACLU what you see as the threat to our democracy and what you think you might do about that. Why don't you do that? But first, tell us a little bit about the ACLU, what it is, what it does, when it started, and what you're doing.
Yeah. So, well, thank you for having me here. And I'm really happy to share this information. Let me first say you're right. Like, we are prepared for this moment. But in some ways, we were built for this moment. This wasn't something that we discovered as the result of the election in 2024. The ACLU was formed in 1920 by a group of people who were committed to the idea that government shouldn't be able to limit or trample on the rights of individuals, and that our Constitution ought to mean what exactly it says it does in terms of individual rights and liberties. So let me just give you one example of that, which is one of my favorite ones. In 1920, when the ACLU was founded, the Supreme Court of the United States had never ruled in favor of an individual when they challenged speech suppression by the government. If you look today, the Supreme Court has ruled hundreds and hundreds of times on behalf of individuals and limiting the government's ability to suppress speech or free expression or artistic expression or a range of other kinds of speech. And so that's just one of the issues that we've worked on over the years. And so in this instance, we're also a national organization with a national federated structure. So we have a national organization in Washington, D.C. and New York. But then we have individual affiliates like the one I work for here in Chicago in all 50 states across the country. And it is really at this affiliate level that we work in the courts, in the legislature, in the public, in this sort of way that we're doing today to sort of begin to shape and help people understand both what threats exist to basic constitutional rights and how they can address them. And what role they can play. And I think that's really what we've been preparing for, as I say, for better than 100 years. We did that 8 years ago when we prepared to face the first Trump administration. And we're certainly ready to do that now with a hostile federal administration in Washington that seems just bent on trying to limit fundamental rights and fundamental liberties and trying to use bullying and coercion both to keep people from speaking out in opposition to government policy, but also to try to make local and state officials believe that they can abandon their responsibilities for civil rights and civil liberties and simply follow the lead of an oppressive White House. That's not something we're going to stand by and let happen without fighting. And so we look forward to these next 4 years. And to the opportunity to really not only resist intrusions and incursions, but also look to what we do next to expand fundamental rights and fundamental liberties, especially in a state like Illinois, where people have clearly chosen to live because they want those things protected?
The country has a long, really mixed history with immigration. We are a country of immigrants. All of us, except the Native Americans, and maybe they came across the Bering Strait. But we have not only embraced our immigrants, but really been critical of them. And in doing a little research, I see that the first deportation of Irish immigrants was in 1794 in Massachusetts.
Yes.
And it went on, in the 30s, there were millions of people, 355,000 up to 1.8 million Mexican Americans deported. I remember living in California a while and learning about the Bracero program.
Yeah.
And, one of the tunes the tune we came in with for your interview was Woody Guthrie's, I don't know what version we played, but Deportee.
Yeah.
That's a song that's always struck with me. We sent back under Operation Wetback, we sent 300,000 people back to Mexico. What do you see as the real threat from the new administration about carrying out his threats to send millions of people out of the country?
Let me say a word first about your sort of setup to this question, because I think it's really important that we go through these historical, what I would call spasms, right? On the one hand, I think probably like many of us, in my family, we often have a conversation about the bravery of people, my mother's grandparents in particular, who came to this country with nothing. And established themselves and built a life for themselves, and how wonderful and heroic that is. And then we forget all that to say that we want to blame other people for all our problems. And, we seem to be in the midst of, one of those spasms in a way that really is putting people at risk. I think there is, I think what I would say as a beginning point is that we should be concerned about the approach that the incoming administration will take. We should be concerned and believe their rhetoric, but we shouldn't catastrophize it. We shouldn't give in and just accept that that's the way it's going to be and that it will be horrible. It will be bad in many ways. And so I think that's one place that I start with. I think there's really sort of three significant threats that we're likely to see in many parts of the country and certainly here in Chicago as a beginning point. And that is that, number one, there will be a ramped up effort to remove anyone who has a final order of deportation against them, and to do that very quickly in late January and early February. My just informed speculation would be that we're likely to see the president-elect, when he's president, and his acolytes sort of doing weekly press conferences where they're announcing large numbers of people who they have removed. Now, it is important to recall that the way that they will do that is to go after people who have had a final order of deportation, who are still in the process of challenging that, who may have some due process rights left, but they will, exercise their power in order to do that. I think that means that we're likely to see people, who are subject to that, who are not necessarily people that are the individuals or from countries that people thought they would be from. I think the second thing that is of concern is that you're likely to see efforts to remove temporary protective status from wide groups of people, including Haitians and Venezuelans and other folks in the country, and then an effort to move to deport that group of people pretty quickly as well. That's harder in many ways, and I think that will be subject to a longer, more attenuated challenge, by whether it's the ACLU, other legal services organizations who do immigration work. I think of our friends here at the National Immigrant Justice Center in Chicago, people like that who I think will be involved in lots of challenges to that. I think beyond that, what we're likely to see, and I think the other part that is at least a matter of concern is, I think we're likely to see kind of a sense of a bullying or a sense of a show of force. That is, in some places, perhaps the use of or the attempted use of whether it's National Guard troops. We don't think that can happen in a state like Illinois without the governor's approval. We don't see that that's likely, at least based on public statements. Where there'll be this effort to make this look like a military operation in order to try to make people fearful, and hope that in some ways, people will make a decision for themselves to simply leave or abandon their efforts at a new life in the United States, simply because, they fear what might happen with regards to federal enforcement. So I think those are the things we're likely to see early. I think that we're likely to see state and local governments. I think we're likely to see, groups like the ACLU and others challenge those. But I want to just make one last point on this, is that we should remember that in Illinois, the law is that state and federal law enforcement cannot cooperate and collaborate in these efforts. And, we have every expectation that Illinois officials have to follow Illinois law. And we know that in another area, we know that someone cannot enter someone's home without a warrant signed by a judge. And so therefore, I think it's going to be imperative to monitor the way in which there are efforts to enforce this, to ensure that we're not just seeing wide dragnets of, federal officials moving down streets, engaging in stop and frisk, or, even, Lord forbid, traffic stops of people who appear to be immigrants and then trying to check their status. So I think there's both, there's the possibility for things that look and seem really, really bad and frightening, but I think there are pushbacks to each and every one of those things.
Well, that's good to hear. Let me ask a little bit about Obama, who, he was certainly not a radical. He was a centrist. He was an African-American. He got a lot of us rooting for him and working for him. But he also deported like 2.5 million people. And I'm not sure if they were all people who were criminals and were not eligible for the DACA. I just wonder what your take is on Obama. And even then, talking a little bit about the role of ICE during the last Trump administration, when they tried to come into Chicago, and one time they arrested 100 people, but we did have little support groups all over the city.
Yes.
Get in the way of ICE whenever we could. And I'm not sure if people risk arrest with that, but I think a lot of people will be ready to stand in front of the oppressors, so to speak. Right.
So I think there's a couple things in there. First of all, I think with regards to the Obama administration, there's no question that in many ways, no administration in recent memory has handled immigration in the humane, thoughtful way that many of us would like, and that included President Obama's administration. One of the problems I think that exists is that we have created this kind of perverse political, desire or incentive that we don't do anything to fix the system. So we're still operating under a system of immigration, that was last meaningfully updated in the 1990s and really probably 1985 when Ronald Reagan was president. And yet somehow we're trying to apply that to a 21st century society. And as a result, what we see is that, we don't have a system that's really based on the number of people we need coming into the country to help sustain the economy. We don't really respect and lift up families in what we're trying to do with our immigration policy, and we tend to have bad outcomes when it comes to things like the notion or the idea of people being deported without seeing due process played out all the way through. And none of this, by the way, has been helped by a Supreme Court, which over the years has restricted the amount of due process that someone gets inside of the immigration system. So I think, and again, these are life and death decisions for many people who are seeking a life here as opposed to somewhere else. So that is one thing. You're right that during the first Trump administration, I think we saw a little bit of the inkling of the kinds of things that we're like, we may well be likely to see early next year. Tom Homan, when he was the head of ICE, the person who's now the quote unquote border czar for the incoming Trump administration, did those series of raids here in Chicago. A lot of those raids ultimately involved, illegal and unconstitutional acts. Again, ICE agents pretending to be police and conducting traffic stops, the detention of people who were U.S. citizens simply because they were in the same location as someone who was believed to be here without documentation. We saw a real overreach in terms of the way in which, those things were carried out. And so, I think that one of the things is that whether it came to a lot of those behaviors during those raids in Chicago, which our friends at the National Immigrant Justice Center challenged, and the ACLU joined them in that, whether it was family separation at the federal level, which the ACLU and other groups challenged legally. I think that there are there's kind of a playbook for how to deal with the excesses of this administration, and whether or not the courts will always be friendly. Is something that I think we can't know, but I think we have to look at ways to try to slow down this mechanics and this machinery of mass deportation. I think we have to lift up the stories of communities. And I think that's where, as you point out, people going out and being present in communities, watching what's going on, being able to tell those narratives. I think, it's going to be important to hear from teachers and principals about what happens in our schools. And by the way, if any of the people listening to us today think that it won't impact them or their children if others are deported, wait until there's a child in their classroom or 7 children in their child's classroom whose parents didn't come home last night, and that will affect your child's education, I promise you. So I think there's a whole kind of overarching comprehensive approach that we're going to need to take to this. And we're going to need, as I say, to hold local and state officials accountable for following Illinois law.
There's a lot there, and there's a lot for people to do. In the closing minutes, I'm going to ask a couple of quick things. Who gets deported besides mostly Mexicans? I mean, is there another group? Are Haitians going? Are people from Africa? Where do we? Who's in the spotlight or has the target on their back?
So I think there are two. I think number one, I think if you look at just the largest number of people, as I understand the data, the largest number of people who have orders of deportation against them are Mexican Americans or Mexican nationals. I suspect if you're really looking at, as a friend of mine, Luis Gutierrez, not the former congressman, but the leader of Latinos Progresando here in Chicago, says you cannot have mass deportations without Mexicans. So that's one group. I think I completely agree. I think that's a place that you're looking at. And the second is you're probably looking at people who've had some sort of criminal conviction for something along the way, and therefore have a final order of deportation, which some court has issued.
Ed Yohnka, this is really informative, and rather than extend our interview, let's just invite you back after a few weeks into the next administration for an update on where things are at. Will you come back on?
I'd be happy to do it. I also want to say, because you mentioned about the role of all of us, one of the roles of all of us, as you said, is to speak up about all of these things. There's going to be a great effort by this incoming administration to limit people's speech and their opposition to their policies, and we all need to resist that.
Yeah, at the outset, I talked about Trump going after progressive, groups in the country.
Yeah.
It's going to get interesting, and I'm glad I'm still living so we can join the battle.
There we go.